Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined as always by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and in this episode we will examine post-pandemic economics and the rise of national populism. Now, wherever we look today, whether it be through a political, economic or a security lens, we can see the consequences of post-pandemic economic instability. And politically, the rise of national populism is in evidence, and as is an apparent anti-incumbent mood among voters. So today, Paul and I will assess the global zeitgeist, but we're also going to define down these principles that we just identified there and see what impact post-pandemic economics is having on geopolitics and geo-economics. Also, at this moment, I'd just like to say that Paul and I would like to acknowledge the passing of Keith Block. Keith was a former Member of Parliament for the Green Party, a forthright advocate for human rights and global independence from imperialism of all kinds. And I guess personally I had a lot to do with Keith over the years, as did Paul. I remember especially Keith's advocacy over the Ahmadzawi case, and Keith featured prominently in a documentary, for example, that I produced on security intelligence failures underlying that case, and it was called Beyond the Shroud, and I was always very grateful to Keith and many others that took part in that documentary. Also, I was always grateful for the trust that Keith offered me with information detailing intelligence surveillance abuses on him that had occurred throughout his life, and when he got his file from the Security Intelligence Services, I was one of those that Keith shared that with, and I kind of thought that, you know, that was an amazing thing. And there was a compassion with Keith, there was a gentleness in Keith, and there was also a trust that Keith gave once you'd earned that trust. So today, Paul and I just like to acknowledge Keith's life and his huge contribution to Aotearoa New Zealand's domestic, but also international affairs too. So ka pai, Keith. Haere, haere, haere rā. May your message in essence travel well. So with that said, let's, before we deep dive into the post-pandemic economics and the rise of national populism, remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, feel free to comment, as we can include your comments and your questions in this program. And we'd like to encourage you to join via YouTube if you possibly can, because on that platform, the interaction's especially efficient. All right, with all that said and done, let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who is waiting online to discuss this big issue, or these two big issues really. Over to Paul now. Yeah, kia ora, Paul. Ka pai to see you there. Looking good, Paul.
Yeah, kia ora. Very, very nice tribute to Keith Selwyn. And yeah, he was one of the good guys. And, you know, it's really sad to see him depart this realm. Many people might not realize, but because I'm a realist and he was a pacifist, sort of apparently ideologically on different ends of the spectrum. But we got along well, and it was because he was a very honest, transparent man fighting the good fight. Okay, I mean, again, I'm a realist. I've been involved in conflicts. I'm not a pacifist, but he was the real deal. It's a genuine article. What a progressive, to my mind, what a true progressive should be. There was no hypocrisy in him. And as you just said, he did well, not only for his domestic constituencies, but as an international relations spokesman. And yes, the Ahmed Zawi case, he was the politician who stepped up when Zawi was in dire straits. And yes, there were other people, non politicians, but it was Keith who championed his cause. And as your book pointed out, in the end, Keith was proven right. Ahmed Zawi was innocent of the contrived charges against him. And it was through his advocacy that Ahmed was eventually released, along again with the help of many other decent people. So good for you to lay that tribute out there, especially for our foreign listeners who may not realize that the Green Party of New Zealand has had some real stalwarts, some real champions over the years. And that's why I respect them as a party, because they tend to produce some very, very wonderful politicians who are as honest as the day is long, contrary to a lot of other politicians.
And I remember, at that time too, that people abroad or people who are new to politics might not have realised that Keith was very isolated in a parliament of 120 odd people on these matters of principle. And he was lucky to have people like Matt Robson that were in a different party, but were able to be there and basically work together as a tag team on a lot of these big and international cases. And but I think that Keith's contribution was huge, and he received honours around his work and what he stood for too, but also over his whole life he was in the scope of the intelligence services for what would apparently be nothing apart from political alliances and calling himself a socialist, and that was enough to put him in scope. So Keith, he like you say, he was one of the good guys. And Paul, I just thought, let's acknowledge that and dedicate the program today to Keith. And I'll hand it over to you to define these major principles that we're going to consider our view of the world today from afar, but through, for example, the post-pandemic economics lens and also the cause-effect and approach to national populism that we're seeing around the world, once again, lingering on. Over to you, Paul.
Oh, yeah. So, what got me to thinking about today's subject were two distinct things. The one, because of some writing that I did earlier in the year regarding Latin America, there was talk of post-pandemic economics, and I'll detail this in a second, and how Latin America would fit into it. And so, I was researching that and how the Latin Americans are responding. I'll give you an idea just to show one example that's worldwide. The pandemic has taught countries that have a certain level of technical capability that they need to develop their own indigenous vaccination industry. In Latin America, the country that was prepared as much as you could be for the pandemic was Cuba, which has a world-class immunology network and system. But no one else did, including the big players like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. So they relied on foreign companies, Pfizer in particular, for their vaccines. And as we now know, there was a two-class system in play where the North received vaccines preferentially and the South were second-class citizens when it came to receiving those vaccines. So that's just a simple example of how now the world is reacting to the pandemic by saying, we better have some indigenous ability to make vaccines, because if we're dependent on the big northern companies, we're going to lose out. We're going to be delayed. So I was thinking of that. And then I was thinking of the rise of populism. Now, I've written about populism in Latin America in its heyday, which was the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Juan Perón was a national populist. Lázaro Cárdenas was a national populist. Uh, there's a number of variations to this, but we're living in an age now where we have this rise of populism throughout the world, but mostly in the North. And Donald Trump is one example of that. But there are many others. And I got to thinking, I wonder if there's a connection between the response to the pandemic and the rise of these populists. And I won't get into a lengthy deal about the difference between right wing and left wing populists. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that they're nationalists first and foremost. Okay, so they tend to be xenophobic and what have you. And then, we'd be splitting hairs between right and left. Left populists, obviously lean socialists, more state intervention in the economy. Right populists are more quote unquote free market, free up businesses to do what they want and less regulation, all of that. That's about the extent of it. So, what happens in the pandemic? Well, what we discover is that neoliberal globalization of production, consumption, and exchange, with its attendant, transportation and telecommunications networks, over concentrated the production of commodities in the hands of a few countries, the People's Republic of China in particular. If one looks at the maps of global trade prior to 2020, it is amazing what went in and out of China. And so obviously, when you see that, you realize, yeah, and if something happens in China, this whole thing stops. I mean, all these supply chains screech to a halt, which is what, in fact, happened. So, in the wake of the pandemic, and where other economies realized how dependent they were, not just on the Chinese, but there's a number of commodity production concentration centers around the world. Uh, Countries began to think about disengaging from long distance supply chains, trying to find alternatives, if not as redundancy mechanisms, so as backups to the traditional supply chains, so that in the event of an emergency, another virus pandemic, that they would have contingency plans and it wouldn't have the economic disruptive effects that we saw in 2020 and 2021. The two responses that have come out of this are known as nearshoring and friendshoring. Nearshoring simply states that it is better to develop alternative supply chains with countries that are closer to you. That the distances involved, let's say, between the PRC and Europe, lend themselves to disruption just by the nature of the very lengthy transportation trails and all of that have to be engaged in order to deliver product to market. And so, as an example, the US government has actually signed on in support of a deal where the chip maker Intel is now establishing a large complex in Costa Rica that will produce wafer chips, which are now overly concentrated in Taiwan. Taiwan controls 90% of the chip industry, which is one reason why the Chinese got to tread lightly when they deal with Taiwan if they're thinking about bombing them, because that would disrupt, them as well. Well, so one answer to this is nearshoring, and that's where I give you the example of Intel and its new factory, its new production plant in Costa Rica, and that actually adds in or dovetails into the second alternative response, which was friendshoring. Now, this one's a little more shaky in the sense that friendshoring is when you prioritize trade with like-minded countries that share your values.
That's
So it goes
something we
back to,
hear more about too, isn't it? Like-minded.
yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just that like-minded countries, and this is something that we've seen discussed even within countries like New Zealand, trying to establish from the government end out to the population some sort of appreciation for commonality amongst groupings. And in the New Zealand context, we see it most likely with relations with respect to relationships in the security intelligence area, correct? And not so much in the trade area, but more and more it seems there's a softening of sensitivities an intensity of sensitivities around trade and difference, whereas it was led perhaps by indifference before. I'll just bring up on screen two, for example, and I'll just ask a couple of questions relating to this. In the past, we saw trade relationships being dominated by either bilateral free trade agreements or bilateral agreements by way of convention, and also with major groupings like the TPP, put it in its most simple form, and the China-led RCEP. And what's up on screen for those that are listening is an overlap, if you like, a graph that demonstrates the countries within the RCEP and also the countries that are within the TPP arrangement. And I know it's got its modern acronym in that respect, but see, it's interesting, this overlap. Taiwan sits just outside of it. Paul's been discussing Taiwan in his brief and definitions here. And also we can see the countries where the overlap occurs, and those countries significantly and that is showing in this graph. Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. The only other thing I'd kind of contribute to here, just as a reminder of the genesis of some of these large blocks, that it was way back in 1999 at APEC, the Association of Economic APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Groupings, that had their summit in Auckland, New Zealand in 1999, where an agreement in behind the scenes between Chile, Singapore and New Zealand, they embarked on the beginnings of what was a trilateral idea of trade that then ballooned out to become the TPP. And New Zealand, I remember reporting on this. I was tipped off by the Chilean government actually about this, and did reports on it. New Zealand was absolutely septic in its response to this, that it was based on no fact at all, but it turned out to be absolutely true. They were just being sensitive to these arrangements. But Paul, without that nostalgia gazing in that respect, I just want to place this. So what we are seeing, this nearshoring and friendshoring, is, do you think it's a move in addition to these large blocks that we've seen in trade and trade relationships, or is it something that could actually do a trajectory or take a journey where they replace such blocks in the future? I'll just put that back to you.
Sure. Well, the how could I put it? Well, no, I'll back up a little bit and then I'll come to that. So, uh, listeners may remember Selwyn and I discussing at some point during the Cold War, trade partners were security partners. So the Western Bloc traded with each other and were also security partners, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, did likewise. And never the twain would meet. Okay, so trade and security were intimately linked in the Cold War era. At the end of the Cold War, and New Zealand was a leader of this wave, there was a move to uncouple trade from security. That you could keep your security alliances, but you would trade with whoever. And people may remember the Obama administration's belief that they could bring the PRC into the community of nations through trade, that the PRC would understand the benefits of joining, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, that these would be, and I do think there was some racism involved here, civilizing influence on Chinese behavior
Mm.
and other countries as well. But the
And
idea is,
this is one of the reasons why New Zealand and this giant, the People's Republic of China, signed the first trade agreement that China actually entered into, and New Zealand was instrumental in the nomination introductions to the World Trade Organization, for example, with respect to the People's Republic of China. So just putting another little bit of extra detail there for you, Paul, relating to that significance there.
no, excellent, because yes, New Zealand was the first Western country to have a bilateral with the PRC. However, it was based on flawed assumptions. The assumption was that the Chinese would democratize, that the Chinese would play by the Western rules of the game when it came to trade. And now what's happened after the pandemic is people have begun to say, the Chinese don't play by our rules. And there is a literature, I think we mentioned this a couple of episodes ago, the varieties of capitalism literature. Not all business approaches are the same across the globe. American capitalism has its own manifestations. New Zealand capitalism has its manifestations. Latin American capitalists behave in very distinct ways, so on and so forth. And the idea after the pandemic, because remember, the Chinese were not transparent. They were not honest about what was going on in Wuhan early on. I mean, that virus had spread for 5 months before they admitted, anyone got sick. And by that time, it was too late. So business elites began to think, the uncoupling of trade from security may or may not be something that is okay, but we're not getting the effects in terms of business ethics, corporate citizenship, and what have you, out of the Chinese in particular, but again, others as well, that we anticipated by bringing them in to the Western laid system of trade. And of course, we've talked about the global South versus the global North. So not all is beneficial from their point of view. But that's all the backdrop to this, because what's happened is there's been this return to wanting to trade preferentially with countries that share, quote unquote, the same values. I think what that means is basically have democratic governments, however flawed they may share Western Judeo-Christian, ethics or mores. I mean, there's a lot of fuzziness about what they mean by sharing values, and then trading preferentially with them. Now, what I would say concretely is if by values you mean that you will obey the rules established for trade relationships, right? So the playing field is level, and you'll abide by them and not try to engage in industrial espionage and all that sort of nefarious stuff, then yeah, maybe friendshoring will work. And so there's a move now to both get production centers closer to markets, and then if they can, get those production centers to be hosted by like-minded countries. And the verdict is still out on that. The move is underway. As I was researching for this show, the literature after 2020 is actually very fragmented. There's plenty on the world system of trade and supply chains before 2020, but it's a work in progress at this point.
Yeah, I'm
But
just going to
here's
say just as a quick one here, Paul. I was just brought up on screen for those that are listening, a graph that was a part of Paul's research here, and it goes back to 2014. So this is 10 years ago, and it shows very clearly on this map what are the dominant kind of product or commodity or value-added goods that are exported from various countries, and the map shows basically, I suppose, an era where it's post-Cold War, you're not necessarily reliant on a bipolarity within your group. That international trade is the way it's happening here in this graph. And what I'm talking about there is it's like a jigsaw of all different colours of mix, like the Russian Federation, petroleum and petroleum products, oil, going down the Middle East, oil, that type of thing, going through Africa, and you can see down the center of Africa, gold, that type of thing, but also oil, obviously, in the north. But you see other things like China, electronic equipment and machinery. Latin America, you've got food commodities, but also transport equipment from Brazil. Up in the Americas, like we well know, capital goods in the United States dominating there, and in general terms, motor parts and vehicles in Canada, all of this type of thing. Australia, like we'd known down in these parts, metals, minerals, the dominant thing. New Zealand, food and agricultural commodity exports. So, what I'm rattled through all of that for those that are listening is that when we start to move toward a bipolarity like what Paul's talking about, or friendshoring or nearshoring, it upsets the supply chains of what those friends and near countries are able to export with any significance to trading partners. So there are all sorts of transitional stresses, transitional crisis that I can imagine here. Paul, I just wanted to bring in at that point this map and some of those things, because these are the challenges beyond some of the supply line challenges that we have because of conflict in the major route areas, security sensitivities like in the South China Sea, even climate change relating to the vessels that can go through the Panama Canal these days. All of these things in a post-pandemic period that are starting to hit and show in a big way. Just on the post-pandemic type of issue here too, David Mooring, for example, has made comments in there that at the beginning of the program and saying it's more likely that we're in a pandemic lull, and he identifies, and I'll just bring up on screen briefly, identifies, the situation of the bird flu, the H5N, for example, and that pandemics may be a thing that keeps recurring. It may not be just post-pandemic. We get what you're talking about. What we're talking about is the response in the post-pandemic economic kind of context. For example, David brings up even at a currently relatively low level of outbreak, labour downtime due to active COVID infections and effects from long COVID is directly impacting the worldwide economy. And he's saying in the present tense, yes, absolutely. And he puts here, first of all, also, what do you mean by post-pandemic? So it comes down to that, Paul, that, from the point of view of economics, my understanding is where we're going with this, and please tidy up with specific detail, Paul, if you can, is that we're looking at the adjustments that were made under urgency when the pandemic was at its zenith, or certainly rising to that point, where we saw interventionist politics and economics starting to really wrap around the domestic responsibilities of specific governments. And as we have moved out of the urgency responses domestically, all in countries all around the world, we've seen an adjustment once again from interventionist government economics to perhaps attempting to discover where the new balance is between private and public in such an economics structure. And I think that's the way I'm kind of seeing it. Paul, can you add to that, please?
Sure, no, and I think you're absolutely right. So there was the immediate response, which tended to be more state interventionist, and we know that begat a lot of arguments and debates. And I'm headed there with the discussion of national populism, so it's good you raise it. I'm thinking now more medium term. Some supply chains will not change. The distances evolve, the product, let's say coal extraction, oil can only come from certain areas. And if you happen to be far away from them, then your supply lines will be necessarily quite extensive. But in places like commodity production, or in sectors like commodity production, perhaps the input factor costs can be reduced if you engage in nearshoring. And I was going to say, apropos your map, the RCEP, that is the Chinese-led trading bloc in Southeast Asia, that is a true free trade zone. Basically, it means they've dropped tariffs amongst, in the trade of goods between those countries. Okay, that's a true free trade agreement. the TPP, now TPPA, is actually an investor guarantee agreement. It's not necessarily about eliminating tariff barriers. It's
For
about
example, the
intellectual.
United States in this context, yeah.
Right. So it's more complex in that it involves intellectual property rights. It Because the Americans are involved, it's very litigious. That is, no lawsuit, no fault clauses are built in. There's a very famous example of Mexico signing into that bilateral, the NAFTA agreement, actually trilateral with Canada, and not realizing that the U.S. intended to dump a lot of very nasty chemical waste, medical waste, and whatnot into Mexican landfills because there was no specific prohibitions in Mexico against that sort of thing. So they were taken advantage of because of the loopholes in that agreement. And mind you, the U.S. would never think of doing that to Canada. You can, make your own assumptions about why that is. Well, the point is that one is a free trade agreement, one is an investor guarantee agreement with some lowering of trade barriers and the like. But what's interesting, going back to your question about whether these sort of trade groupings, these multinational trade groupings, will be enhanced or superseded by this move to nearshoring and friendshoring, I would say that more than likely will be enhanced in that these countries will try to develop autonomous production centers, become hubs of something. And of course, we now have new economic sectors. Well, just think of the rise of electric batteries and then electric vehicles and whatnot. That's given rise to the lithium trade, creating, whole areas, South America, Australia, that are lithium plentiful, which have now become major sources of investment. The countries in question are well aware of this resource and they want to take control of it. They don't want just sort of Ricardian investment. That is, let's say the Chinese or the US companies come in, take over all of the lithium sites, and basically pocket the profits on their way out once the resource is exhausted. That's not going to happen under the current schemes. And I would say a lot of this realization that some degree of economic nationalism is needed if you want to remain independent and viable as a nation state. That, I think, is accentuated by the pandemic. The vulnerability of neoliberal globalization schemes to black swan disruptive events has now been laid bare. And so the idea is, we got to hedge against those sort of events. And so we've got to develop, if not an indigenous capability through the full spectrum of economic activity, which is obviously very difficult to do, but certainly get things closer to us so we have redundancies in the supply chain so that if something goes down, in one country, we have alternative sources and we won't have the disruptions that we suffered during the pandemic. Now, where does populism come into this? Well, this is one of those unexpected consequences to what was essentially a medical event, a medical economic event, if you will. And it runs like this. And of course, we know that populism of all sorts pre-existed the pandemic. I mean, this is not just a recent phenomenon. But think about it this way: if you have mainstream economists saying, okay, the neoliberal supply chain networks were too vulnerable to disruption. So you need to start building in redundancies. You got to get your trading partners closer to home, make friends with them, all that stuff. Who politically would benefit from that turn inwards, from the turn to economic nationalism, which may or may not involve more state involvement in the management of the economy? Well, foremost amongst them would be populists. But here's the rub: populists are centered on nationalist economics. They absolutely are. Populists of all stripes give primacy to developing their own economies and not being dependent on other economies for their standards of living.
I'll just
That
give an
much.
example of that too. You know, the last time Donald Trump occupied the White House, and it dovetails into David Mooring's question here. Any similar chart for the financial sector around the world, especially London and New York dominance? No, I don't have a chart that's demonstrating specifically that, but what I'll just bring up on for discussion, Paul, was when Trump was president of the United States the last time, he had this nationalism brand, obviously. With respect to the economics, you could see isolationism starting to show in different ways, but also the trade war with China, but significantly too, that impacted on the UK, particularly Manchester, Birmingham, and significantly London with its financial transactions, as Trump made a move, for example, to bring the HQs of United States or American companies back home. And what we saw was a move of that. We saw big ones, for example, where any trade prior to Trump, for example, any trade that was going on that had a United States component, but if it was headquartered in London, for example, may actually escape having to pay withholding tax by way of the beneficiaries of those in other countries around the world. I know from personal experience now with Trump's thing, where he brought those HQs home, and even if the HQs didn't come home, any trade that took place in the United States, even though it may be headquartered in another country, was liable to pay a withholding tax on that trade, even though it was perhaps not even going through the United States' borders. So you can see the nationalism in an economic sense starting to actually grip hold of the requirements and the compliance elements of trade and paying their dues, even though there may have been very little that was realised in that prior to Trump's thing. So I just wanted to bring that up to show that that is a living, breathing example of the economic nationalism or nationalistic populism in an economic sense that came through with Donald Trump. I've got to say, Biden did not change that. It's still the status quo as it is today. So, that's an interesting kind of realisation of that. Back to you, Paul.
Yeah, and in fact, Trump was an economic nationalist during his campaign in 2016. Okay, this is pre-pandemic, and then in fact he did at least deliver on some of the promises, not all of them. When you started making your points, I was going to say, yeah, except that Trump never returned jobs to the American Rust Belt. That was all pie in the sky and what have you. He was just trying to improve, well, A, get elected on these nationalist grounds, and then improve the terms of trade with the PRC and other big partners by invoking that nationalist sentiment. I'm going to turn away from you if you don't give me what I want, right? He likes to drive a hard bargain. Well, the pandemic, of course, now is giving him more structural substance to the argument that you need to rebuild America's industrial capacity, and that's shared all over the world. I mean, the English are thinking about this, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, the Koreans are like, we really need to, if not divest, diversify both what we can make here and then the amount of investors, the type of investors that are involved with us. So that insofar as it goes is not a problem. I mean, if it turns out state responses to the pandemic crisis are to turn inwards and try to develop comparative advantage in unusual or non-traditional productive schemes, I mean, that's good, right? It's a source of employment. A lot of technology transfers can occur. So I'm neutral with regards to this. But where I was heading when I started putting these two things together in my head last week was that, yeah, but what goes along with economic nationalism? Now, let me just confess, my social science training has a lot of Marxist in it. And one thing Marxists like to do, and I still do, is when I think of society, I think of the base and the superstructure. The base is the economy, the mode of production and the relations of production. The superstructure is the society that's built on a given economy. In our case, it's post-industrial agrarian, right? New Zealand's still very dependent on agricultural commodities. In the United States, it's gone into TikTok land or, wherever these guys are at now, but Silicon Valley driven. And so you have civil society, political society, and then whatever regime runs the show as the superstructural aspects of a given base. All right, just to simplify Marxist analysis. And so Marxists can be very boring because if they're sincere, they always start with economic issues because for them, that's the fundamental. That's the essential, as it's been said. And everything after that are superstructural manifestations. Now, mind you, an advanced capitalist society's superstructure looks a lot different than a primitive agrarian society. I mean, not only are the relations of production very different, but the social relations and political relations that are derived from them are quite different as well. So, that's the backdrop to this. Well, economic nationalists emphasize exactly that, the autonomous ability to conduct your economic affairs in such a way that you have relative independence and flexibility when it comes to economic choices while maintaining a given standard of living. But when we say nationalism, right, when we start with economic nationalism, where can we immediately head if we're a less than salubrious politician? Xenophobia, bigotry. It's the Chinese flu. And they sent it over here, came out of the lab, and they allowed it to escape so they could hurt us. It's all those migrants. They're steaming over the borders, and they're doing that so they can infect us with their, inferior cultural values. What I'm saying to you, Selwyn, is economic nationalism is agnostic when it comes to who's involved in the productive apparatus. But unpleasant politicians are not agnostic. And so the US may need South and Central American labor to fuel its economic machine, even in economic nationalist terms. But politicians then will point to the color of the skin of the migrants, to the fact that English is not their first language. And they will engage in culture wars to the effect that they scapegoat people for political effect.
Now,
And
we
so
saw this once again, Paul, and David Mooring once again. Sorry, I'm picking up David. Sorry about I'm picking your things up to illustrate all the time, but they're right on the mark. And David is talking about Brexit and populism. And I was over in the UK not long before the Brexit vote. What I saw there was exactly what you're talking about, where, the scapegoatism was rife. The identification of various groups that had been welcomed under the EU agreements, people like from Poland, were not only ostracised and pointed at, but their shops were boycotted. All of these service centres that they'd set up, the good old English nationalists didn't want to go and shop in them. And it was almost like the Poles were used as the most recent example of racism and bigotry that the United Kingdom Brexiteers, if you want to put it, could muster. Before that, it was the West Indians. Before that, it was the Pakistanis. Before that, look, we go back and back. And those from in Tibetan times certainly haven't escaped over the years in different ways. It's just that most of us over there shared a similar colour of skin to the British, so we escaped the easy identifications of them. But Paul, this is the real life living thing. Now, David's question here was Brexit's populism the high tide mark in the UK? I'm seeing a lot of anti-populist kickback leading to the upcoming UK election. Yeah, there may be a kickback from some in the population, but we're still seeing, for example, on the manifestos, on the campaign platforms of all the parties in the UK that have significance by way of size, the Labour Party among them, Brexit is not mentioned. It is way down the line. In fact, it is avoided. So have a look at that. That is another example of where the country is not wanting to even identify these large movements of the recent past and even to detail where they stand on them for fear of raising the whole thing once again. So I'd say that it lives well and truly within a Brexit umbrella in those countries, and the results of the election cannot be put down, the pending elections in the UK cannot be put down to some sort of erosion of nationalistic social agreement within the population and the politics. But Paul, that's my view. I just wanted to chime in with that one and put it back to you on that.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with Nigel Farage in this year's election, because that'll be representative of whether or not these sort of racist nationalist tendencies have gained any sort of traction in the UK. Now, getting back to the larger point that I'm trying to make is that the post-pandemic move to economic nationalism gives structural underpinning to the superstructural nastiness of xenophobia, bigotry, and the like. That's where I'm headed. That it was never intended to do that. It was simply a response by capitalists and capitalism to the vulnerabilities of extended supply chain disruptions. But it's given ammunition to politicians, mostly of the right-wing stripe, but not exclusively, who take the superstructural aspects of nationalism. Say we're a white Christian country. I mean, I'm seeing a lot from Europe these days, and it's very unpleasant. The anti-migration backlash, and it's all cultural. Now, there's very little mention of the fact that the laborers in factories in Germany and whatnot are predominantly from places outside of Germany. And in the cases that had colonies, like France, they're mostly from the colonies. France, Portugal. I've been reading about Portugal since I lived there for a little bit. It's close to my heart, and now they're got the problems with the migrants, which they did not have when I was living there in the early 2000s. And I think a lot of this is just unscrupulous politicians scratching an itch. They've decided the best way to pursue political advantage is to touch the dark side, to scratch that dark itch of racism, xenophobia, and the like. And you can add, any other amount of prejudices to the mix. But those are the fundamental ones. Europe is for Europeans. Make America great again. The idea is, we've lost it. And why have we lost greatness? Well, it's because of all this other stuff going on. And so, because I do believe in Marxist dialectics, that is, we don't evolve, evolutionary in a Darwin sense of the word, but that actually the pendulum swings back and forth along a broader contour. That what's happening is that economic nationalism, justified as it is as a response to the structural crises of the pandemic, is now offering an underpinning to very unpleasant sentiments being stirred by politicians throughout the world. I mean, if we think about, for example, some of the language of Narendra Modi in India says that Muslims are a drain on Indian society, that they do not add value to what he believes is a Hindu nation, that they detract from it, that they're less educated. Anyway, he goes the full spectrum of their, what did he call them? It wasn't parasites, infiltrators. But the idea is, the Hindu people are industrious, cohesive, all that sort of thing. And it's these other people who are coming in and, they're taking away from Indian greatness.
So that's the Hindutva type of nationalism that we're seeing there. A country which is wrapped around its Hindu interests, and many are responding. Perhaps this is, connecting to, in a broader sense, what David was talking about before. Many, obviously, in the Modi electorate were of Hindu origin were thinking, no, enough of this, and in part put their votes in other places, necessitating Modi to actually pull on the support of another country, another party of like mind, if you like. But it was still a necessity to reach out beyond his own in the last election, which could show a little bit of movement, perhaps. But Paul, back to you. Sorry, I just wanted to bring that part in.
Yeah, no, very well done. And so the idea is, it's the law of unintended consequences. You have this shift in, economic models, or business behavior. But what is unanticipated is that the political class will take that and run with it in a different direction, rather than promoting again, unity and cohesion and horizontal solidarity links between people of different faiths and colors and whatnot, all to advance a common project. Instead, politicians run with the politics of divisiveness. And it's not just the US. We see some of it here in New Zealand. We definitely see it in Australia. I would say that throughout the liberal democratic world, there are politicians who really don't want to talk about the economic aspects of why this needed to be done, and why perhaps the state needs to be brought back into macroeconomic management, because the market did not cope well with the pandemic. It took a lot of state stimulus to get even the big pharma companies to respond quickly. And, the political scientist in me says, maybe people will realize finally that the market is not the solution to all social problems. Neoliberalism has its limits. And
there could be a school of thought that is saying that what we're seeing in the pressure points relating to economic instabilities around the world in this, what we're defining as a post-pandemic crisis period, is the move back toward this codependency, or this co-balancing act between state intervention, which took a dominant role, and the private responding back in part by degrees as we move forward. The instability in the markets, the instability relating to insecurities, the supply chain consequences of the imbalances, with all of these other pressures that are coming on it as well. So what we're seeing domestically within the economic structures, aren't we, is a high cost of livings, and elevating the inflationary pressures. We see the dominance of the United States financial institutions, and also its settings with respect to its official cash rates being higher than normal in the United States. That sees that by necessity countries like New Zealand, Australia and others having to go higher than the United States, basically so that they can attract foreign capital into that investment and currency sectors. So all of this kind of thing that we're told domestically are the remedies to counter the high cost of living, the high and inflationary pressures. It's just simply not working fast enough for the population. And the population, while they go to express their votes, seem to be able to be seduced by the politic that is more divisory, that is more exclusive as opposed to inclusive. Paul, that's what I'm seeing around the world, and what I'm interested in is to see whether or not, and I guess David in his comments has been testing this too, have we seen the national populism reaching a zenith? Have we seen that it's run its course, that yes, it's still there, it's still a dominant force in the way it's expressed, but the politic that supports that type of thing is becoming out of step with sections within the voting public, and that those may be signs of medium-term demise for such nationalistic, divisive politics and rhetoric, really?
Well, I think on the one hand, the structural problems of the global economy today cannot be fixed with fiscal policy alone, especially fiscal policy that goes on a nation by nation basis. It has to be a more systemic or systematic approach to not regulating production per se. For example, no capitalist state is going to tell producers that they have to stop with the just-in-time production scheme and go back to stockpiling supplies in the event of a major rainy day. They're not going to interfere at that level. If you think just-in-time production is the most efficient way to deliver goods to the market, the capitalist state in this era will not interfere. Now, on the other hand, regulation of capital flows and that sort of thing, that's well within the purview of capitalist states. And again, capitalist states in Western democracies, they're ruled by political parties or coalitions. And so the specific trajectory of bringing the state back in as a macroeconomic manager will depend on the political outcomes, the electoral outcomes in the first instance, but then the policy outcomes that these governments bring. And here's an example. France is about to have a snap election. Why is it having a snap election? Because Macron's party got absolutely destroyed, not in France, but in the European Parliament elections, which now has a majority of right-wing, dare I say it, populist parties represented in it.
Yeah, the radical right, as it's been determined, yeah.
I think the zenith has not been reached. I think we're going to see more of this.
I think that what we're seeing too is this phenomenon, a zeitgeist, if you like, amongst particularly the younger voters that are coming within scope of being able to express the vote now, where it's anti-incumbency. And that is something that perhaps we could see in South Africa. It's something we could see within the EU votes from all of the European nations, where the Conservatives, the centre ground, is looked at with disdain. When we were in our youth, we probably felt exactly the same. But what we're seeing is it being reused as a tool of resistance in a way that destabilises that. But is also perhaps in past generations, we would see that anti-incumbent type of movement wrapped around centre-left type parties in large course. What we're seeing in the context of today is that it doesn't matter if the party is of the radical right or of the left. It seems like we're seeing a distribution of that anti-incumbent resistance being expressed in major ways. That is what I'm kind of looking at when we look at particularly South Africa, the UK to a degree, but certainly within the EU states, certainly within Germany. But within the radical right, what is also clear is there's no uniform policy platform. For example, some of the radical right coming out of various countries support the Russian Federation Putin regime's advance into more broader geo-identifications. That others are dead against that. Some are pro-NATO, some are absolutely not just agnostic, but anti-NATO. So we're seeing all sorts of a mix within the radical right. In the France expression of it, what we're seeing is the left forming a constellation, I'm pinching your word there, of how we can view not necessarily coalitions, but a constellation of parties to be able to fight off the influence of the radical left and also show some sort of unity around being a vote of a choice of voters in this election. That is a fascinating one coming up for Macron's centrist party. Paul, that anti-incumbent kind of movement, if I'm accurate in that, do you see that as some sort of mediating force against populism, or is it going to actually increase the risk of it lasting longer than it need necessarily last?
Well, let's put it this way. You mentioned our youth, and so let me go back to my 14-year-old self, where I had the answers to everything. And so my answers would be along the lines of, when it comes to the economy, build it at home. Charity begins at home. America for America, Argentina for Argentinos, so on and so forth. I think that is where the right is scratching the itch. It's simplistic. It's anti-woke, because apparently, you're woke if you give rights to other people, which somehow are going to detract from yours. But the point is simply that the anti-incumbent response is a visceral response to the failures of democracy in practice. We cannot get around the fact that liberal democracy is on its knees, and not because Putin or President Xi have brought it to its knees. It's been reduced through its own flaws. The venality of the political class, the corruption, the sclerosis, nepotism, all these things have corroded democracy.
It's huge.
Yeah. Hypocrisy have corroded democracy from within and undermined faith in democracy as a political form and regime type. Remember, we talked a while back about the Pew Research polls that show that democracy now is not the favorite regime option for half of the world, including people in liberal democracies, including old and young demographics. I mean, it's scary that democracy is no longer considered to be the best possible option given all the others, right? That old phrase, yeah, it stinks, but then look at the alternatives. Well, people now respond. They don't just think, but they respond to authoritarian appeals to efficiency, to law and order, of course, always law and order, to what they would call national integrity, which basically means, boot the, non-whoever's out. And so I think that what we're seeing here is the sort of long-term sclerosis of liberal democracy now being undermined further by both structural and then these superstructural issues. I mean, culture wars have no economic import. In fact, the logic in the States is that the Republicans and conservative media talk about culture wars because they got nothing on Biden when it comes to the economy, that he's actually rebuilt the economy very well since the pandemic. And so they go after, things that are very consequential to the people who are being targeted, but in the overall historical scheme of things are inconsequential to the progression of the nation state. And so I think that, especially the youth, and I take as an example the Argentine youth that voted for this guy, Javier Milei, in Argentina. I mean, again, it's a full-on freak show with that fellow. Again, he calls himself an anarcho-capitalist and a libertarian of sorts. But young men voted for him in rather significant numbers. And in the polls, I watch Argentine interviews because, man in the street interviews, and they say things like, yeah, but it'll piss the political class off. Or we're
so this is the Trumpism type of thing of we're going to drain the swamp.
Exactly.
So you're seeing that. Yeah. Okay.
That's exactly what it is. And you anticipated me because I'm like, okay, I'm watching an Argentine version of the Drain the Swamp. And Bolsonaro in Brazil, he had the same shtick. Let's throw them all out and then restart again. That I would lay the fault for that. In the first instance, I lay again the failures of democracy in practice. We also have to remember that one of the backdrops to this discussion is that we are now into the second generation of global youth who will not be as well off as their parents in aggregate. My older children, now in their late 30s, early 40s, were the first generation, where in aggregate they were not going to do as well as my generation, while their kids are not going to do as well as not only their parents, but my generation. And this is a global phenomenon, again, in aggregate on average. And so that, I would argue, is the sort of social structural reason for the disdain for democracy in many places and the urge to just throw them out, to get, whoever they are, get rid of them and let's start from scratch. And in that sort of atmosphere, ideologies start seeping in. Maybe Millet's got a point. Anarchy. Maybe anarchy is better.
Well, I
Then
wonder too
democracy.
whether or not, where the state, no matter how it's expressed, no matter what party is in power, is not delivering for the individual. The individual feels that. And we know that right-wing, particularly radical right party ideologies wrap around that the individual, is that the response perhaps can be manufactured from a voting public if we pitch to the individual. And we saw that perhaps in New Zealand in the economic experiments from the late 1980s through the 1990s to 96 in particular, where an individualistic society was there. And it wasn't, from the New Zealand, I suppose, the voting public, and certainly the young would be able to say, well, it didn't work, did it? And perhaps that's a bit of a buffer from the way of expressing in a very deregulated, market-driven, small government footprint type ideology that was coming from centre of the capital, Wellington, in the New Zealand context. But getting back to this is a fascinating thing where national populism perhaps can be seen by the individual as an answer to the woes. And so you see it expressed in different ways. In the Argentinian context, like you're saying, it's tear down the barricades type of thing. You see the Trumpism-led mantra, drain the swamp of these cronies and influencers that pretend that they're acting in your interests, but they're far from it. But at the same time, do nothing about things like gun laws and anything else really. From the cry and demand of families all across the United States. So, what do you make of all of this? Is it any wonder that those that are wrapped within a democratic kind of structure are thinking, well, this just doesn't work? From the point of view of the bipolarity, and you see the rise of those in authoritarian states. There's something that you raised in 2023 in one of our episodes where you made a comparison and you'd grown up within one of those authoritarian states. And you're saying, for many, and I'm paraphrasing, it'll come straight from your mouth much better, but it was along the context of, as long as you didn't engage with the politics, didn't engage with authoritarians, you're basically left to get on with your own lives. And you kind of see that in the Russian Federation context with the Putin regime. This thing where the population basically, if they are able to work out a way of keeping out of their road, maybe they can get ahead. And the maybe is the question within the population there, while these, the mafia state, the regime within the Russian Federation has its fun. And it's certainly the difference, though, from previous generations in that context, without going down a tangent, is that the reliance that the the Red Army may step in and address inequalities should the politic get too heavy on the population. That doesn't seem to be able to be a reasonable assumption to rely on in this day and age. But Paul, getting back, we've done programs on bipolarity. Is there any wonder, where is the shift with all of this chaos that seems to be manifesting within some sort of equilibrium that's out of balance within the democratic side? What are we going to see in the medium term? And let's head toward wrapping this up on that basis.
Okay, well, I see things this way. Well, you mentioned Putin, and I would just say as an aside, uh, you'll see that conservative church leaders, conservative social conservatives of all stripe, tend to see him as defending traditional Western values. As much as you and I both know that's not what is happening. But you see people defending him because of the decadence of the West. We let gay people have rights, all that sort of stuff feeds into the national populist narrative, that sort of ugliness. And it's a very effective political mobilization tool, right? Feed on fear, feed on hatred for political partisan purposes. So, as I said before with these EU elections, I don't see national populism diminishing anytime soon. However, I think the answer, believe it or not, is in capitalism. That is to say, capitalism is now adjusting to this post-pandemic moment. And we've talked about some of the structural adjustments that are now ongoing. In fact, are still early days in the making. Well, think of it this way. If Wall Street and Silicon Valley in the States decide that Trump has lost the plot, and anyone who watches his rants at his rallies knows that the man is not mentally well, he becomes bad for business. He interferes with the adjustment process because he's a raving lunatic. And so, be it Marie Le Pen in France, be it any number of politicians in this day and age, if their national populism starts to interfere with the business of getting on with business, then it will be for business to oppose them. And it reminds me, I had a good friend in Washington in the Defense Department. He had been a Clinton appointee. And after I left the Pentagon, he moved on to other areas of the federal bureaucracy, again, as a political appointee. And we've stayed friends ever since. But years ago, when I was in Miami, we met up. And I said, okay, so are you going to stay in government and whatnot? He goes, no. He goes, you don't understand. The political class, they're the puppets. I'm going to be a puppet master. And to do that, I have to go back into the private sector. Then I'll pull the strings and they will dance. He had a beautiful way of, summing things up right on the nose.
Did it
and
work out for him?
Huh?
Did it work out in that respect for him?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But he's a player behind the scenes, right? Now, he's more Democrat oriented, but he's a player behind the scenes. He doesn't want any public attention. He just wants to be back there in the darkness pulling those strings. And he knows the way that game is played. He knows it a lot better than me, I can tell you that. So I think of that, and I think, here, capitalism can't afford to have the rhetoric of a presidential candidate or a coalition in Europe interfere with profitability. If you have an American first thing where you demand of corporations that they employ X amount of US born citizens, identity checks for everybody, there won't be a chicken production plant left in the United States. because chicken processing, and the U.S. is the biggest consumer of chicken in the world, uh, is done by basically foreign labor, undocumented labor. The dirty little secret of the chicken industry in the states, and so they don't want this national populist rhetoric to get out of hand. And maybe a lot of the populists are not sincere. They don't really hate migrants. They don't really think that we have to return the economy to our own industrial base. Maybe they don't believe any of that and they just want to get elected on those grounds. But I have a feeling that many do, in fact, believe what they say. And so then it's up to the globalized capitalist class that still remains transnationalized in nature. Their networks are not national exclusive. They are international. To say, look, at this ideological movement is inimical to our business interests. And so we have to get out there and from behind the scenes, from back in the darkness, we pull the strings to undermine these guys' electoral chances. Now, whether they do that legitimately, whether they do that through influence operations, I mean, there's lots of skullduggery that the transnational economic elite can get up to. But my point simply is, it's not going to be you, it's not going to be me, it's not going to be the youth, it's not going to be women, it's going to be this class of entrepreneurs, bankers, and the like that will finally put a halt to national populism, not because they know it's authoritarian, xenophobic, and nasty, but because it's bad for business. As simple as that.
Yeah, that can be quite a frightening prospect when you consider, the 1930s and the post-depression years, what we saw in Spain, Germany, and some of the significant industrializing countries of Europe at that particular time. But I guess what I'm getting at is I certainly wouldn't place my trust within the responses of the corporate sector to right what is a populist wrong. I think, once again, I'm dipping down into episodes of the past that we looked at with your experience of Chile, for example, and that the regime there with Pinochet, it seemed from what I took out of the key points, was sustained for a lot longer than perhaps, or the policies of Pinochet sustained a lot longer than would not be expected because of the influence of corporation interests and elites within the country and within the geo-economics of South American continent in its own right. But Paul, I'll pass to you for the last word, and then we'll wrap up. And I'll bring up, as we're doing the last word, some of the comments that have come through in the last hour of that we've been online. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah. So what I would say, and your fears are well founded, but I'm reminded of something that Keynes said back in the 30s, where he said capitalists want regulations to prevent capitalism from capitalists. That is to say, when they know that it's in their own self-interest to support regulation, let's say of the finance industry, health and safety standards and whatnot, because left to their own devices, they're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So they allow the state to come in and impose certain universal regulations that level the playing field for everybody. They accept that as the cost of doing business. And we're reaching that moment now. There's a readjustment of thought about the role the state has to play post-pandemic. And so I think that they see that it's in their own self-interest to move, the return to nationalist economics in a productive direction, not in a destructive direction. And so, although I share to some extent your lack of faith in the corporate class, I think their own self-interests will provide a good buffer to the more venal proclivities of people like Donald Trump or Modi or Viktor Orban, any number of these crowd. And I'll leave you with one final thought, which we may pick up down the road. Uh, in all of this, New Zealand has bucked the trend. New Zealand ends the pandemic and doubles down on deepening its free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China, does nothing to safeguard New Zealand from supply chain disruptions, does nothing. And I learned that when I was looking at New Zealand's relations with Latin America.
It
Absolutely.
ignores it as a fact. I mean, there is. Sorry, I'm jumping in on your last word, but there is significant reports coming out of New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that was part of the research that you shared with me earlier on. And yeah, let's just bring that. Might as well bring that up on screen if we can. And so we're kind of what we're looking at there is some of the things that our Ministry of Trade has noted that have adjusted due to the stresses of supply line chains around the world. But at the same time, generally is working on the same framework or template as we did prior to the pandemic. And that is something that I'm just agreeing with you on that point.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, the best efforts of MFAT notwithstanding, the political class has basically said, let's just go back to what we did before.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to pay a price for it. Now, that has a lot to do with the agricultural lobby's influence in Wellington, that sort of thing. But here's my final thought. Even here, with they're still clinging to neoliberalism as an economic model, still when it's been proven exhausted pretty much everywhere else in the world. This crowd, particularly the center-right government, is torn by a fundamental contradiction that they don't even see, and that is the rise of national populism within their ranks. New Zealand First is a populist movement. I would argue that the ACT Party, under its current leader, has right-wing populism written all over it. And so the big party, National, which has people with populist tendencies, are finding themselves, they're the dog getting wagged by that populist tail.
And from both sides of its flank.
But it doesn't jive with the economic model. You cannot have xenophobic people in government still in the same coalition with people who believe that there's nothing to see here when it comes to finding alternatives to the current supply chain hierarchy. And so I think it's interesting how these things play out, because the parties that are national populist in orientation or partially in orientation, they're feeding on the superstructural aspects, the negative aspects that I've mentioned earlier. Whereas at the structural level, the base, we're still playing at neoliberalism. And I just have a feeling that contradiction between the superstructural rhetoric of the minor parties in the coalition and the structural orientation of New Zealand as a whole, at some point, something's going to give. And it'll be the end of that coalition as a government.
Interesting times. And that perhaps is a flag because of New Zealand picked up on perhaps the Zeitgeist earlier on in 2023 when it went to its general elections, and what we're seeing is perhaps in part replications in significant economies around the world. Once again, we started this program with an acknowledgement of the contribution in the life of Keith Locke. And it seems there's an irony, I think, that we've been discussing economics in a global sense, free trade and arrangements internationally in the course of this program that we've dedicated to Keith. And I suppose for those that knew Keith, we could just consider, what would Keith say? What would Keith say to all of this? And out of that, we might get some very good, cool, sane directions. So thank you for those that have taken part in the live recording of this program, and thank you to those that are listening to this on demand or seeing it on demand. We will be back in a couple of weeks with another hopefully thought-provoking issue to be able to discuss and dig down deep onto. Until that time, take care, ka kite anō, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. And if you like the program, do subscribe to it on the platform of which is your choice. That'd be very much appreciated. Goodbye.